and they're probably not going to listen to you, even if you give them things. But if you can give them an example, if you can actually show them that you've done something differently and that it works, that can pique their interest.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to this episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner and I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each episode, I get the absolute privilege of sitting down with different people that work in different organizations that are, day in, day out working on business processes, whether that is working with a team to understand what's actually going on, what is the process, or whether it's talking with someone that's in an organization where they're looking at how do we improve that process and then how do we automate that process, and all across the life cycle of business process management. And today I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Steve Barnes, who's known as the process expert, and is doing a lot of consulting work and in various organizations, including councils. He also is a web expert and a creative photographer. So a few other interests and passions there. But Steve, I'm really interested or excited for this interview today. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So what we might do to begin, and this is how we normally begin, is I pass the ball off to you to give us a bit more of a background. And if you can take us back to where process first piqued your interest, and then take us on a journey leading up to the work that you're doing today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that when I started in IT, everything was based around information.
Right.
So I walked straight into an IBM facility out of my studies, and it was all relational database. And so it was, sort of get to this table, update this row, edit this row, delete this row. And everyone was just thinking around that. And and there was some functional design, but that was where things were at for a long time. And we had, Finkelstein's sort of stuff around relational design theory and so on and so forth, and the fifth normal form, all the rest of it. But it took time for me to start to get an interest in process and for process to start to appear in discussions as well.
Right.
I think the time that really got my interest was when we were dealing with distributed networks, and I was working as a consulting for the Department of Housing in Queensland, and they had distributed systems, and so information would come from one to the other and into another, and they didn't seem to realise that they were actually dealing with the same business objects as such, and so I said to them, guys, you need to start to design your systems around recognizing that you have effectively the same information out of a business model, but it's in different systems. And there was actually a synchronization process that went with that, and a changes of state also. So I started mapping out how that worked, and it was mainly around what I was calling distributed business object design. Now, I hadn't come across any theory stuff at that stage. But when I got to Suncorp a while later, and I was their first solution architect in 2000, just after the dot-com crash hit and wiped out my consultancy along with many others, I went to Suncorp, and it was a great gig. I was there for 2 years roughly.
Right.
And they threw me into managing the CRM implementation. Now, that was actually the biggest rollout for customer base in the whole world. It was millions of records. And my friend Mark Hocknell was invited to go to America to talk about it because it was big news. And I ran the integration workshops. And once again, I started to look at distributed object design and how that all worked. And the more that I looked at it, the more I realized that there were processes involved.
Right.
Now, there were workflow technologies around at the time, but there wasn't a lot happening that was to do with business process. But I started pushing buttons on that, and I published a white paper that was effectively web services and talking about orchestrating them. 6 months later, out comes the web service standard, and I'm thinking to myself, I must be on the right page here. So I kept on pushing, and as I found that despite Gartner Group validating some of my thought, I wasn't getting the traction that I wanted at Suncorp. I was very, very fortunate. Had a wonderful career move and went across to Premendo, or as they were then Open Engineering. And so that was a fabulous move. And what really got me going is I started to look at process technologies, because I designed the customer service backbone for Brisbane City Council.
Right.
We were looking at that, and we built the whole thing in Java and cut down the implementation of new services from about 12 to 15 months to 3 or 4 months. I'm starting to say, look, there's got to be some technologies that we can use to do this stuff. We can't custom build everything. And I started looking, and lo and behold, up comes Intalio. Intalio published the first language that was a competitor to BPEL and was actually more intelligent than BPEL. It just didn't get a standards race. But they had a product that was Intalio N3 that was a business process engine that did all the automation. And I got involved with them. I went across to Silicon Valley, spent some time there, went and trained CSE in Singapore, did a roadshow around Australia and New Zealand. And that was it. That was when process really hit for me. I'd been looking for it. I'd been craving it. I knew that we needed it. And Intalio not only saw that and created the standard, but created this wonderful business process engine as well.
Yes. That's amazing. That's great. And talking about standards or notations, how important is that to use that? Because there'd be some people listening to this that they're in an organization where maybe they're about to start understanding or what's actually going on and how can we improve that. How important is having a standard or a notation that can be followed?
It's absolutely crucial. Absolutely crucial, because it is the connection, it is the language that we use to talk to each other. And if our understanding of language is different, then the connection's wrong. And we've all run into conversations where there are misunderstandings about semantics, about words, and people say, "Oh, sorry, I didn't get that." And it can be in the same conversation, it can be later, there can be consequences because of it. Case in point, as I said, I ran all the integration workshops for the big CRM implementation, and that involved a customer index that we custom built as well. And I remember one workshop must have had 12, 15 people in it, and I was diagramming on the board using a standards notations, UML at the time. BPMN wasn't actually quite out yet. And I think I was doing sequence diagramming, and this girl got up and said, no, it's like this. And she drew a couple of bits and pieces. Now, she'd been in Suncorp for a long time. She knew the systems, and she drew it. And I got about half a dozen, yeah, that's it, from around the room. And I said, well, hang on, which notation is that? Because people are going to walk away with different understanding. Oh, no, it's fine. It's all good. And away they went. And it really hammered it home to me, because there were one or two people shaking their heads, but the majority ruled at the time.
Right.
And because I was fairly new in Suncorp, and there was politics involved, I just let that one slide. Well, let it go to the keeper. But it really brought home to me just how important it is, because I could see a couple of people shaking their heads at the time that she drew it, and this massive consensus around, yes, that's right, but what was right about it?
Right.
No, what aspect of what she'd drawn was right, and what did the lines represent? What did the shapes represent?
Right.
There was no saying. People didn't know if it was information, if it was applications, if it was interfaces. It just wasn't quite certain. And what BPMN does for us is it provides us with a wonderful, rich notation that that effectively glues together all of the dimensions that you'd find in the Zachman framework. You know, the what, where, how, why, who, when, where sort of stuff. It really is inclusive of all those things as it describes a process, and that's what's so wonderful about it. And when the first version of BPMN came out, I actually commented on the standard from a holistic modelling point of view, that we really needed to be able to pin organisations and roles into it, particularly with regard to dynamic roles. And some of that was taken on board, but it certainly matured as we got to the second version of the notation. And at this stage, it's fairly rich. And the good thing is that the tool vendors can actually see where BPMN integrates with definitive standards for other kinds of, well, the kinds of models that are included in the BPMN notation, such as information. So an information diagram, organisation, an organisation model.
Right.
So all of those supportive models, of course, they're not in the BPMN notation standard.
Right.
But the smart vendors have taken in UML models mostly to supplement and to glue together those things through dialogues. So, and there goes my phone. So, yeah, it's really opened things up. The BPMN notation is wonderful. It does need supplementation with other notations in order to flesh out a full business model.
Right. Now, apart from not having a standard or notation in place, what is one of the biggest challenges or mistakes that an organisation make when trying to understand, manage, and improve their business processes?
Look, I think that.
Or is that the biggest challenge?
I think there's a number of challenges that organisations face when they're starting on the journey. One of the very biggest ones is that they lack understanding about their business model.
Right.
So, if you walk into your average large organisation like a bank, an insurance company, even something like Tattersalls or so on.
Right.
Then what you find is you find experts in applications. And when an application is getting old and it can't do this, it can't do that, and it's time for change, they say, okay, well, let's spec out what we need. Okay, what does this one do? Let's go and find out all the good things about this one. And then we'll go from there and see if we can get something that solves the problems. And what happens there is effectively when they got their very first system, it might have done 80% of what they wanted.
Right.
And so they got an 80% fit. They probably didn't have a full business model at the time. They probably went shopping for applications. That's what happens a lot. And you live with what you've got. But when it comes time to replace it, if the business goes and says, well, let's see what we can get relative to what we've got, there's a danger that you can get 80% of 80%.
Right.
Which is 64%.
Right.
Okay, so you're actually eroding business value because of the way that you're managing your business model. And if you can't have a very clear goal in place, a very clear business model, a business dimension, we could call it, then you're in danger of sliding away and losing competitive edge. Because the applications that are out there, they will give you an 80% fit. They're good at that. That's what they do. But if you just go with that and relate to your applications all the time, then you'll erode value. So for example, the OOBE framework, there are three dimensions. There is the business dimension, the application dimension, and the technology dimension. And the applications are actually your business model fulfilled using the technologies as such.
Right.
Okay, now there's packages in there, of course, but the business dimension is a model of the ideal world. This is the way that we really see our business. This is what should be happening. This is what we want to happen.
Yes.
The applications is where we're at.
Okay.
And even if we go and get new applications and we try and fulfill what we want from the business model, we're still going to have some points that they don't align in. Well, if you get a change of CTO or CEO or a few more people, I mean, how are they going to know where that misalignment is? Even if you go to that, where's that information? Where does the IP live? Who's got it?
Right.
You need some good modeling tools to be able to design your business dimension and record your application dimension, what's actually happening. And of course, your technologies, how the applications use the technologies. Now, because we've moved to the cloud, the technology front's changing, because things are commoditizing, because we've got containers, because there's web services making integrations easier and REST and all the rest of it. The technology stuff is probably not quite as pressing as it was because it's becoming better managed. There's been a lot of effort going in there. What's not better managed is the business dimension.
Right.
We've got people that are application experts. That's always been the way. But the future here is managing the business dimension and getting real value out of it.
Yes.
And that runs from strategy through to enterprise patterns, through to design, through to implementation, and then down to specific instances, if you like, if you're going to go all the way, as do the applications. What kind of application, what class of application? Oh, it's a CRM. Which CRM? It's
right.
Insightly. Okay, which instance of Insightly are we talking about? So everything runs from strategy through to enterprise patterns, through to designs and implementations and so on, technologies included. So driving that business dimension is really, really important. So you've got to have a framework to support all those things.
Yes.
You've got to have a capability in your business that is able to look at your pure business model and implement that. And this is where business process engines come in.
Right.
That you can design at your own will the important pieces of your processes. And if you've got applications that are in there and you know that there are gaps or things that aren't working very well, then you've got this wonderful facility where you can actually decide, okay, well, we're going to take that chunk there. We're going to create our processes around it. We will integrate into the applications and give them what they need so that they're the systems of record, but we're going to create the process the way we want it. We're going to have this extra information. We're going to have these extra checks. We're going to go and push it out to this vendor, all those sorts of things. So that you can supplement what your applications are doing through that kind of technology.
Right. That's great. And talking about, we're talking about challenges that an organization faces when, embarking on that journey. Do you have any examples that come to mind where there was significant value delivered from business process work, whether it was a minor tweak or a radical innovation of something that does anything come to mind where it's like, yes, this team, they identified a critical process, they changed this or they changed that, and this was the value that was delivered?
I think that probably the more recent and good example of that would come from my work with Moorabool Shire Council.
Great.
They asked me to go in and work on their planning process, their strategic planning process. And that's something that councils constantly get hit on. You know, why is it taking so long? Oh, God, we've got to go to planning. I just want to put up a fence, you know, oh, the extension. Oh, you're joking. We can't do this. And why is it taking so long? Well, every council is getting hit on this, and some councils are finding it harder than others, especially councils that are going through growth. So their organisations being stretched, they're having to bring on new people. Mirabel was in such a place, but they were also in a place where they were just going through regenerating some of their systems.
Right.
And they were behind the 8 ball with this particular process. And it was time. It wasn't variations. It wasn't people issues. It was purely, we are not doing this fast enough. Now, there had been about 3 groups of consultants, I think, before me that had been in there, and there'd been some results, but a lot of them were fairly high-level sort of stuff and
Right.
fairly generic recommendations. I think I was probably the first person that actually got his nose right into the mud and found out what people were doing. So I interviewed a stack of people. What I found was that because they had experts come in from different councils and were using this system, that there wasn't a consistent use of the system. They therefore did not have a baseline. Therefore, data that they were lifting out of that was not 100% consistent. And I believe there's been a lot of really, really good work going on at Mirabel, and they have a new guy in charge of that department who's an absolute expert, and there's some great stuff happening there. But what I found was that hereditary practices on the way that they put these systems together had meant that that things were not being done in the best order. And so one of the things you go looking for is the order that things are done in, the dependencies between them, parallelism, so on and so forth. And when I go into a business and I start talking business processes with them, I actually try and draw a value chain through the middle, and then the services layer down below, and the management layer on top. And you may be familiar with that sort of stuff. But what really highlighted as I went through that was that there was a service component that was blocking the value chain.
Right.
And as we pull that service component out and put it in its place, all of a sudden there were a few days gained, just like that.
Wow.
That came fairly quickly. They're working with the applications that they have still. They don't have a BPM technology in place. But the thing is this, if you have the business process mindset, you can walk into any situation with any stack of technologies and applications and start to look and see what's really happening. And that's what companies need. If they're in a mess, if they're not being productive enough, if they're at odds with one another because of departments, then they need someone that's got that business mindset. And so organisational design resistance is something that actually hinders the implementation of good business processes. I'm not just talking about people being resistant, because you can have fragmented management, different opinions, you can have resistance down in the ranks, that happens as well. Organisational design resistance is really where the organisational design does not facilitate your value chain.
Right.
Elon Musk said something really, really interesting about this maybe 9 months ago. He was talking about these SpaceX rockets, which many of us are familiar with who like a bit of technology or excitement.
Yes.
and he said that they'd been, really knocking their heads against the brick wall, and their design process was just coming up short and running into problems. And they'd had a few goes at doing this design, and he stood back one day and he realised that the problems that they were having in their product design were really a reflection of their organisational design.
Right. Okay.
And I thought to myself, wow, that is such a cool statement, that the flaws in product design, the problems in product design, and it could be service design as well, were a reflection of their organizational design.
Right.
So when we design our processes, well, you've heard about matrix management before?
Yes, right. Yeah.
Okay, so matrix management doesn't look just at the silos, but looks at the value chains that run across the silos and starts to advocate for the relationships and the handovers and stuff like that. That's the sort of thing that is needed to start to break organizational resistance.
Yes, right.
And one thing that that I always love to think on as I go into this kind of consulting is how is the management structure helping or creating resistance for their key processes?
Right.
And that is fascinating. And having those conversations with senior management can be very interesting. And it's one of the places that you find that these guys have got their stakes in the ground and don't want to move sometimes. It really takes some convincing, you know. And I haven't done that recently, but it's something that's always on my mind.
Yes, yes. Well, I'd be interested to dive into that further, because there would be people listening to this that they're in an organization, and there are quite a few out there that in an organization of thousands of employees or hundreds of employees, they've got one person that's been labeled the process improvement specialist or the process design lead, and process improvement's not really a thing that's fostered at their organization. They're trying to get more buy-in from the executive team, or maybe they're not even in a role that's associated with process, but they're listening to this conversation and they're like, our organization needs to understand our processes better. How do they approach that executive team? How do you pitch to them? How do you communicate to them? How do you, I guess, use words or use language that's going to motivate them? What are they looking for? What do they want to know when it comes to business processes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that for guys that are down in the ranks, there's a very, very big challenge there to try and get change. You know, one of the biggest things that will happen, of course, is, well, hang on, who are you and what do we employ you for? Why are you trying to tell us this?
Right.
You know, it just doesn't work that way. Some organisations just like to do things the way they do.
Yes.
And anecdotally there, when I left school, I did a management course with Maya, and this was before computers were really around, mind you. And a few years down the track, one of the HR managers said to me, "Steve, you are trying to change things all the time." And I said, "Yeah, well, I'm trying to improve them." You know, and it went from stock takes through to display, traffic patterns through the floor, how he presented things. And she said, "Yeah, but you can't, because people are used to the way that we do things." And I thought to myself, well, isn't that interesting? Well,
yes.
You know, that was the red flag.
Right.
I left. and very shortly afterwards, I landed in computers, and that was a wonderful move. But that's what happens. We have organizations that they do work, they may be successful, and they've got a lot of years behind them with proven systems. Some of these organisations will look at the situation that they're in, and their opinion will be that we can't really do it any better. This has been tried and tested. We've figured this out over time. This is the way it is. And so when people are involved in that kind of organisation, in, let's say, middle management or an area of technical expertise, trying to get a conversation with management around, I think we should change this, can be very, very difficult for them. I think that really you've got to find a way to do a low risk and fast example to put up in front of management. That's one thing that Gus Balwanton talks about, you know, the former CEO of Lonely Planet. He says that if you can get rapid examples, rapid change in, and test it without spending much money to present evidence, then you will actually be able to evaluate that and know if you're on the right track and avoid the pitfalls of spending lots of money and having teams on things. And that would be my advice to people who are inside an organisation and would like to see positive change. It's all very well to sit there and get depressed about it, or to bitch about it, or to say that we need a big project to change it. You're not going to get management buy-in in that respect, and they're probably not going to listen to you even if you give them things. But if you can give them an example, if you can actually show them that you've done something differently and that it works, that can pique their interest. Yeah.
That's great. And I have heard examples of that before where, you know, an individual within a project, within a team, process hadn't been adopted enterprise wide, or, you know, every organization is delivering value through process, but it's do you actually understand what's going on and improve it? But this guy, he was part of a project, and he had quite a strong BPM background, came into this project, used what he knew about understanding and improving your processes there. They saw value on that smaller scale. The business unit took notice. They then adopted BPM. The department then noticed. They adopted it. And before you know, the executive team was like, hang on a second, why are these guys outperforming every other area of the business? We need to adopt this as well. So I think that, yeah, if you can start small, prove that value, show that it works, it will get noticed.
It will. And sometimes there are situations where change has to happen. And that is a wonderful position to land in. When I was working for Premendo, I ran Premendo training for a short while, but I did casual consulting when I was running Business Geeks in Queensland also. I can't remember exactly when it was, probably about 2006 or so. We actually had Virgin Airlines staff come to us for training. And so I ran training, I think, on business analysis and business process improvement. They had been tapped on the shoulder by CASA, the Civil Aviation Authority, because they were running all of their maintenance off a spreadsheet.
Right.
And, you know, it was like, oops, oh, what did that cell have in it? Hang on a second, you know, running critical maintenance that human life depends on off of a spreadsheet was a very brave move for these guys. But they ran on the smell of an oily rag to start with, but they needed rapid change. The great thing about what they did was that they engaged with that thirst for change. They got educated, they were motivated, and the change started to happen quite rapidly. And they've grown into an incredible airline, really. And they've survived, despite the bumps, they've survived. So that was a great example of people who knew that there was a need and they had a thirst to learn and to go forward, and they really did succeed. They did marvelously well.
That's great. That's good. You mentioned earlier about, you know, bringing people into the people that are performing the processes, bringing them into a space or a room to understand or facilitate that workshop where you understand, well, what is actually going on. I'd imagine that with bringing different people into the room with different opinions and different perspectives, you're probably going to get a different understanding of what the process is and what's actually happening. How do you facilitate that? How do you manage that? How do you, I guess, work with that team to understand what is actually going on? Because you need that baseline before you can start improving it. So,
yeah, it really comes down to an understanding of human dynamics. If you're going to be a person that runs effective business process or business improvement projects, then you need to be good with people. And that's not just being a softie, that's being someone that can negotiate as well. Right. And it's something I had to learn to do. Certainly, my mind goes back to a project that I ran in QUT just prior to the dot-com crash when I was still running my own consultancy, and they asked me to design their new website, and I had about 13 or 14 different parties that were literally at war with each other. And trying to iron out requirements was probably, well, the feedback later on was that was the most marvelous thing that happened, because running the technology project is something that a number of people could have done. They said that the game changer for them was that I was able to get people on the same page. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's a web requirements thing, or it's an advertising project, or it's a business process improvement project. If you can't get people to a common point of understanding of the facts, and then get agreement to go forward, you're not going to win. So getting that common understanding in a scenario where we're doing business process improvement is actually easier in some ways than with other kinds of projects, because we have at our disposal the BPMN notation. We have, sort of object modeling or entity relationship modeling diagrams, organizational diagrams. No one argues about organization. Everyone will tell you who's where in an organization.
Yes, right.
But it really, really helps. And going back to the example of Mirabel with the planning process, it was during individual interviews that I started to suspect that there were discrepancies. So they'd asked me to interview staff. And as I went through, I thought to myself, well, hang on a second. That's not what so-and-so said.
Right.
Hang on a second. I'm sure that's a different bit of progress there, that this happened before that. And I started to compare my notes and the diagrams that I'd drawn. And we got them together to run a baseline workshop. During that workshop, I would say, and I don't think I'm telling tales out of school here, but it is common, let's put it this way, it is common that if you have a bunch of people in the room who some of them regard themselves as experts, and they're all using the system they think successfully, you're going to have some resistance there.
Yes, right.
But it's getting the facts on the whiteboard or into your modeling tool in a notation that's scientific, like BPMN, that you will start to get, well, that's not the way I do it. Well, it's the way I do it. Okay, guys, if we've got different ways, let's note them out. Let's get them drawn up. And then let's have a discussion about best practice.
Right, right.
Because there are people out there that don't have best practice. Now, we can't do continuous improvement, which is based on measurement, until we have best practice implemented, until we've got our baseline. And there's been many a project that I've gone into where people think that they've got that baseline, but it's not really there. And so what we have to do is business engineering, or business process re-engineering, as they might call it.
Right.
And that is really taking a look at whatever evidence is there and designing a process to start with that is then going to give us the metrics so that we can start to say, okay, how can we improve? Let's cut and measure and see if it helps. Oh, yeah, that one was great. Oh, that one was bad. Let's back that out. Let's rethink that. Why? Why did it fail? What can we try next? And so when you've got the baseline process in place and you go forward with versioning in a slow and considered way, and you start to measure and cut, often the changes become more finite. You start to think very carefully about what you can do. But you do need that baseline in place.
Yes,
If
right.
you haven't got it, you've got nothing to work with. And much of my work over the years has actually been much more to do with business process re-engineering and organisational design and the large grain sort of stuff, the negotiating with the people, than it has to do with continuous improvement. So although I'm a fan of lean, and I really believe a lot of the lean concepts, and would probably like to be involved in a couple of good projects in that sort of area, my main skills are really, they fall out of enterprise architecture. I'm talking about enterprise business architecture, right from strategy down to design through business applications and technology, enterprise business architecture, the whole lot linked to strategy. That's my real background with this stuff. And that's what drives my design for an organisation that gives them their baseline.
Right.
So that's where I come into this. That's where I start. Yeah.
That's great. That's really good. And looking to the future of business process management, and every organization is, at a different level of BPM maturity. They're implementing different things, and they will require different things at different times. But if you were to look at the next 2, 3, 5 years, what trends do you see, and what would you where do you think organizations need to be pouring their time, effort, energy, and money?
Very good question. I think that one of the most important things for BPM in the coming time is that we have provable links to our strategy, and organisations often, because of the way that they get their applications in place and they have champions for teams, once they've made the decision about getting an application, it's almost like there's a disconnect happens from strategy, and they stop looking at their measures, and they think, well, we do the best with what we've got. Having traceability from strategy is one of these areas I think that's going to be extremely important. And in that, we're looking at service level agreements, we're looking at KPIs. Now, there was a project that I was involved in. It was a marvellous project with a fellow called Gordon Lisinski, who worked for iOctane, which is a Melbourne-based consultancy. Very clever guys. And they were the Australian vendor for the ProVision modelling tool at the time, which is something I had a good bit of experience with. And Premendo offered me up, head on a chopping block, along with this guy, and we went across New Zealand and worked for Vector, which is a huge energy utility, really, really big. And they had this proliferation of equipment and wanted to get control of it. And we used, at that time, what was the best framework that we knew, and that was the OOBE framework, and there's derivatives of that now, to literally say, okay, up in the business dimension, in the strategy area, you've got these concepts around what you want to happen as a business. You've got your KPIs, you've got your organizational design falling out of it. Move across into the technology and applications area and go down into detail. You've got servers, and you've got applications that are running on servers, and you've got the technology in the servers, right down to a hard drive that are servicing that thing. Now, what we did for Vector was we connected everything together for them right across that framework, so that when they had something go wrong with a disk in a server, they could trace the disk up into the server, they could trace the server across into the applications that it serviced, they could go across from the applications into the business side of things, they could look at the business processes that was involved with, the KPIs, the SLAs. Bingo, these are the alarms we need to ring. Right. And that was a marvellous project. I'm talking about, that was probably 13 years ago, I guess. And these guys were really thinking about what they needed to do to get a hold of their organisation and to manage it really well. And so that was driving their organisation through strategy and connecting everything back to the KPIs and the SLAs. I think that's where we're going. And as we model out our processes and connect them into strategy and then implement them, we need to retain those linkages so that if something goes wrong, we can very quickly ring the alarm bell and say, hey, sorry, we're breaking an SLA here. That's
Right.
important. And to know that you're fulfilling an SLA because of the stats that are coming out of your business process engine.
Yes.
So I think that those implementing measurement points into your business processes very, very deliberately to say, this is related to that KPI, that's related to that SLA. That's really important because every business process engine has such a voice, they call it. Every process has a voice. And if you listen to what's going on there, you can learn. And so connecting it up very deliberately and watching it is important. And that's where business dashboards come in.
Yes, right.
If your statuses are all over the place, if they don't really relate to your SLAs and KPIs, then you've got a problem. So business rules notation, that's going to be really important.
Right,
That,
right.
I believe, is going to mix into our business process engines. That's only just sort of baby steps at the moment. There's some good rules engines there, but I think that often it's manual integration. I think we're going to see that. We're going to see more low code that is more sophisticated because there are limitations, and all of a sudden we're into coding. I've seen this on product after product, and I've worked with quite a number of them. Ease of integration. Ease of digesting a REST service or looking at web services discovery and getting that right and just instantly being able to use it. That is going to be really, really important. Having the right management consoles in place for our process engines, being able to integrate with CRM.
Right.
That's going to be huge.
Yes.
There are a few engines now that are designing offerings around a CRM core. And so they started off as business process engines. They started doing a lot of work with CRM, and that was seemingly this core of what they were doing with processes coming in, processes going out. They formalized the offering, say, we have a CRM with process management, like Creatio, for example.
Right.
Which was BPM Online. That's where they've gone. I think that we're going to see better CRM integrations. And one of the challenges for CRM in general is there's so much coming into it in terms of sales and stuff, and so much going out of it in terms of fulfillment, that it's the implementation is very dependent on integrations.
Right.
The question comes, at what point are you better off using a product that you can design all your processes and integrations really quickly and really easily, being a business process engine, rather than purchasing a CRM?
Right, right.
I think that we're going to see this blending to some extent going on there. Social integrations, that's going to be enormous because there's a lot of intelligence out there.
Yes, right.
And I think that we're going to see either direct triggers into processes, or we're going to have listeners out there that will watch for certain things and trigger processes as well. So, someone said a bad thing about our product out there, let's trigger an investigation process,
Right, right.
And other feeds as well. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a number of directions there. I've probably given you about 10 or so.
Yes, that's great. No, really interesting what the future is going to look, and it's going to look very different for different organizations. And now for someone that's listening to this interview and they've learned a lot from our conversation today, but they want to learn more. They want to understand, okay, what next? I'm learning about BPM for the first time, but I really want to know how can it be applied to my organization? And, we have the internet, but sometimes the internet can be quite overwhelming because there's so many different opinions and perspectives there. But what would you recommend, Steve?
I think that for me, a couple of the standards organizations are very important if you've got a technical mind. Certainly, I'm a member of the Business Architecture Guild, and there's some good information there. I think perhaps on BPM itself, specifically bpminstitute.org may be a better resource. And certainly the OMG, the Object Management Group, they took over management of the BPMN notation, and as such, they're a good place to go as well. And you've got your other standards and notations that, as I'm saying, vendors are gluing together with BPMN to make a very viable sort of platform. So yeah, those would be my main recommendations. And then there's some vendors sites. If you go to a few different vendor sites, you're going to find some of them are very simple, like KissFlow, for example, or Flowingly. You know, there's ones that are really quite straightforward that are basically form flow things, but they're still using the basics of BPMN. But there are also some vendors that are more mature in the way that they handle things, and you know about that, Daniel. You know, and as such, some of the materials that you'll find, examples that they run on their sites, you will find out more information, and that's often about the how-tos, but you'll learn about what's possible through that as well. Yeah.
But I appreciate you giving us some insight there. Well, Steve, obviously, like within, I think we're almost at about 45, 50 minutes now for the interview, and despite 50 minutes, we can only scrape the surface of a few different topics there. You know, it is such a broad, diverse space and topic, but I know that the audience that are listening will be able to glean quite a few points. And I think that's the main thing from this conversation is if one person can take away one piece of advice that they're able to action and implement, then that's a win. You know, we're trying to spark conversations. We're trying to spark collaboration within different organizations. And I think it's a very interesting conversation that we've had today, and one that I know people will glean a lot from. So I just want to thank you for sitting down and joining me here for this conversation.
It's been an absolute pleasure. It's nice to talk about the subject matter that I'm passionate about, and to be able to explain some of the things that are in my heart, because I don't often get to give that kind of overview. So I'm pleased that we've been able to do it, and I hope that people out there really benefit from it. And certainly from my perspective, you know, I'm out there as theprocess.expert on the web, no .com on the end, and I'd be happy to field questions. And I guess we're publishing this on YouTube, anywhere else?
YouTube, LinkedIn, it'll be all on all of the different audio platforms. It also, snippets of it will go up on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the younger crowd. So it will be going up in many different places. So we'll probably have different viewers that'll add comments, ask questions, and guys, feel free to connect with Steve on LinkedIn. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions following on from this conversation.